What if you could use all of your church communications to ignite a passion in your people for your church's vision? What if you could communicate information and create inspiration in people at the same time? Communication does not have to be an obstacle to ministry. It can actually be an opportunity to cast vision and challenge your people to join you in your church's mission.
Welcome to the Transforming Church Culture podcast, where today we're going to talk about how pastors and ministry leaders can create a comprehensive, vision-driven approach to communication. My name is Brian Berman. I'll be your host. I'm with Charlie Broxton today. Charlie, how are you today?
I'm doing good. Can't complain.
Excellent. Hey, I'm looking forward to this because, Charlie, you've been in ministry almost 30 years. And over the years, as we've talked about, you've seen and experienced some effective communication churches do, but also some ineffective communication. So what are some of your key thoughts as we talk about communicating more effectively?
Yeah, I think, it all comes down to vision. Churches and ministries that communicate effectively filter all their communication through the church's vision and ultimately the values of the church too. You think about it, many times churches communicate to their people a lot like the internet communicates to us. We sit down and we're just bombarded by information. And what ends up happening is we then become the filter for the information that's coming at us. But what happens with churches that communicate effectively is they filter all communication through the vision. So basically the church ends up being that filter, and we're able to get across the information we need to while igniting this passion in our people. So it's more than information that we're communicating. It can be information, but it's information tied to vision. So it still ignites that passion in people for what the church is all about.
That sounds really good. And that's inspiring for your people. So I understand what you're saying. How does that play out practically? What are some tips if leaders want to be able to do this, not just information, but kind of some inspiration? How can they drive their communication? What are the how-tos?
Yeah, I think, there's kind of three thoughts that I have regarding this. They're not steps. It's not three steps. It's kind of a continual process. But three thoughts that I have is the first one is, as churches, we need to saturate all of our church communication channels with our vision and values. The idea is this, that you over communicate vision and you season that vision with details. This way, as a church, you determine what's most important. Again, you become the filter for your people.
That makes a lot of sense, Charlie. And why that makes sense is maybe you've heard the phrase, when we think we've over communicated is when you begin to communicate. So yes. Unpack that a little bit more. What's that look like?
Yeah, again, it goes back to that continual bombardment of information. If you just think about our lives, we have information. When you open your iPhone, information's coming at you. You go online, information's coming at you. You go sit in church, information's coming at you. It's always coming at you. And, when I think about church, we do a lot of the same thing. I can't tell you how many times I've stood up front and given announcements. And then somebody 5 minutes after the service will say, hey, what about so-and-so? And I just gave a platform announcement, or someone just gave the platform announcement. And a lot of that comes back to all the info we're throwing. But if we filter that info through the vision and season with details, it becomes a little bit more easy for our people to take in that information. We can and should basically impart that information, but it should be intentionally selected and tied to vision.
I've had that same experience, Charlie, where I've given an announcement and people come later and go, hey, what happened there? We even in our service recently, I led communion, a 7-minute communion part of a service. And when we finished the service, some people asked, I thought we were going to do communion today. And they missed the whole communion in there. So I want to ask you, how do you season the communication? You mentioned it's not just information, but you season it. How can you season it? What are some good examples?
Yeah, the examples are kind of endless. But if you think about what you're announcing, and then you think about why your church exists, make that announcement through the lens of why your church exists. So if you are, let's take the virtual world we're in now of church. If you mentioned in our last podcast, some churches doing an ice cream social. Well, why are they doing an ice cream social? If you're making an announcement about an ice cream social, tie it back to the vision. Maybe your church is very much centered on the reality of community, and you want to connect with one another. Connect is part of the vision. make the announcement of the ice cream social online on Zoom through the lens of the importance of connecting and how that ties back to vision. You think about this, it can be endless. Let's say maybe that ice cream social online it's about more of kind of connecting with people who don't believe. Then you're
Sure.
going to cast the vision of invite your friends. And
Mm.
here's why this is part of our vision. We want to be an outreaching church. So again, the info is given through that filter of the vision. It's not just info out there floating. It's info tied to what's most important to the church.
That makes a lot of sense. And I can see how we can do that in our announcements. It's going to take some intentionality and some practice to do it. But let's say you kind of perfect this. You're getting it together, you're doing it well. What kind of communication channels do you use? There's a lot of choices out there. How do you decide what to use and how to communicate it, what the media
Yeah.
is?
That's that's a great question, because you think about it. When I started off in ministry, there were just a few channels. This is
Mhm.
cave writing, carving in rocks. Okay, maybe
That's
it
right.
wasn't that old, but you had the church mailer that went out. You had platform announcements. I'm trying to think what else was the bulletin, the church bulletin. Those
With
were kind of
about
the
26 inserts in the
okay.
bulletin, right?
And that we can talk more about that later, but that's where you really it's like the internet. You're bombarding people with info and it's not tied to vision. But you think now there's so many communication channels. I had to write this down. I'll read off my list: Instagram,
Mm.
Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, mass email, websites, blogs, platform announcements, church bulletin, all those extra flyers you stuff into the bulletins. And I'm sure there's more that I'm leaving off. But this leads to my second thought, and it's this: we must be intentional about the communication channels that we use.
Good.
Um, some churches believe they need to be on every platform. And what I've learned in my, I think of previous years, is it is much easier to start out on these platforms and start going than it is to maintain them. Platforms, communication channels take work. And so we've got to be selective with the channels we use and the information we communicate.
So which channels should we use? We're always looking for what's the silver bullet, what works 100% of the time. What are the most effective channels to be using for church communication?
Yeah, that's it's another good question. There's no set answer. It really is specific to the church. I think it's
Mm.
important for churches to be on multiple channels, but to be very intentional about the channels they use. So, kind of a few ideas. If you're sitting through and thinking, well, what should we really be on? Here's a few ideas. First, intentionally choose channels that your people most use. If you're working in a church with people mine and your age, a lot of us and above are on Facebook. That's going to be a great primary channel for you. If you're
Mhm.
a younger church, you are going to have to look at things like Instagram and Snapchat and figure out. Snapchat, to me, I don't get it. Obviously, a lot of younger people use it, but you're going to have to figure it out because that's where they're going to be. And so really, we got to first intentionally choose the channels that our people most use. But the other thing I challenge churches and ministries with is to intentionally choose one channel where people you want to reach are most on. And so if you're targeting a younger group and you're an older church, you've got to go where the younger people are and choose one of those channels to do that. Lastly, I think it's really important that as churches and ministries, we are intentional about the channels that we don't use. We shouldn't use more channels than we can manage, because it says something. If someone goes to your Instagram account and you haven't posted in months, that communicates something right there. Your lack of
Sure does.
communication communicates something, and it's not good. Same thing's true of all those platforms. So we can't use more channels than we can manage. Also, we've got to be willing to adjust our strategy on each of those channels. If something's not working, adjust it, figure out a different way of doing it. And then lastly is we should not be afraid to stop using channels that really are ineffective. If we're not reaching people and we're not engaging people, because it's not just information thrown out there, it's information tied to vision and it's engagement, then we've got to be willing to say we're dropping this for a while and shut it down, not just to keep it there. Because again, people go there, they see it, and it communicates something if you're not engaging on it.
You bet. I totally understand that. And I think one of the obstacles that pastors and especially older leaders have is just the learning curve to
Oh my
know
gosh.
what are all the options out there, and do I have to become an expert on any of them or all of them? And I think one thing I've heard you say is you don't have to know how to use every platform. You just need to know somebody who knows how to
Hmm.
use every platform. And so you can kind of raise up other leaders who can carry out that vision of the church,
Yeah.
but can put it on those different media. You mentioned being willing to stop things. How do you know if something's effective or ineffective? When do you stop it?
Yeah, with online channels, social media, blogs, websites, things like that, you have built-in statistics that you can go and you can see clicks, responses, interactions, engagements. And when those numbers are low, it's an indication that either the channel's ineffective or your strategy is ineffective, and some kind of adjustment is necessary. So look at the stats. Non-digital communication, things like mailers, platform announcements, bulletins, it's a little bit tougher to check engagement, but you can talk to people in the church. You can do some kind of surveys to see, is it really hitting people? And going back to vision, is it helping to communicate our vision?
Right. And the numbers we're always counting in churches, we're counting nickels and noses. How much is put in the offering, or what's our financial situation? How many people are there? So what I hear you saying is to do the same thing with your social media, those things that really are important to you. And you determine what effective is. Is it going to be people engaging? Is it going to be people viewing? But to really be honest and be able to evaluate all of that.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
how do you use your staff? Let's say you have a team and you're the lead pastor, but somebody else is running a student ministries page or a men's
Oh,
or a
mhm.
women's page. How do you keep all your leaders on board and kind of doing the vision driven rather than just each going their own way?
Yeah, it's a perfect transition to the third key thought here on vision driven communication. And that is to make it a priority to communicate first with staff and leaders. And there are
Mm,
two thoughts behind this, two ideas. Is the first one is this: a great way to value your staff and leaders is to communicate important information with them before you communicate it to the congregation. In the years that I've been on staffs and not the leader, I cannot tell you how many times that I have heard important information at the same time the congregation has heard it. And as a staff member, I go, okay, I want to be a team player, but there's part of me that goes, do you want me to be a team player at those moments? I
that's right.
love it. I love it when I hear things before the congregation because I feel like I'm part of the team. It's even better when I'm involved in the process of that decision making, but I know that's not always possible. But to be included, to be shared with first, it communicates value to me as a staff member. The second idea behind this is more important, actually. It's this: your staff and your leaders will either magnify your vision driven communication or they are going to impede it. And either way, it's going to be exponential. So if
Right.
your staff and leaders, they get vision, they get why of the information, and it's tied back to vision, people are going to ask them questions and they're going to be able to spit back and say, in their own words, what you've already communicated with them. And so your communication as a leader has just been doubled. When you have more staff and more leadership, it continues to grow exponentially. And so they are going to be the greatest ambassadors for that information and that vision. And that's where it becomes huge. I've walked into churches where you'll ask somebody a question and there's good communication because they will give you the answer. A lot of times they may even tie it back to vision, and you're like, these people are on the same page. I've
Right.
also walked into churches and worked in them where you'll ask someone on staff or a leader a question and they're like, I don't really know. Why do you do that? I don't know. And that's when there's a communication issue. And so your staff, they're either going to exponentially increase your communication or they're exponentially going to hinder it.
You bet. And you're going to have to keep track some, I think, of how your staff is communicating and what they're communicating because they can know your vision and values. One of the teams that I led, we had four values: truth, authenticity, community, and hope. But I had two people on my team who could recite those to you, but nothing that they communicated reflected those values.
Hmm.
And so I just want to underline and emphasize that importance that you just shared, that your staff has to be on that team, but that could take a lot of time. So how do you streamline your communication with your staff and leaders so you're not having to have all of these meetings all the time, or so that you don't become the bottleneck where every
Yeah.
piece of communication has to go through you or somebody on your team. How do you kind of release them? How do you communicate to them and make sure it's happening?
This has always been a challenge for me because communication, I'm kind of a leader that thinks, well, people should know that. And I've learned the hard way early on and a little bit easier as time has gone on that is just not the case. People don't. They can't know what I'm not saying. And I have to say things a lot of times to reinforce. And so in my current situation, we started using Slack, which is an online platform. And it is one of the easiest ways to communicate with your staff. It also is a great way to hold staff accountability, and it's publicly accountable, not just you as a supervisor or boss.
Right.
Slack allows for, we have a lot of stuff on our website that talks about Slack, why to use it, how to use it, but it really is a way where everyone is going to see that information. And instead of going back through email chains and, oh, what was said here, it's all in one place and it's in your face pretty regularly. We at our church, we use for all in-house communication, we use Slack, and for all outside communication, we use email. And we don't use email in-house. This really brings it central, and everybody does see it.
That makes a lot of sense. And right now we're in the COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic. And so people are asking the question about communicating. And just heard a funny story. When you have a Zoom meeting, make sure if you're screen sharing that you do turn off things like your Slack, because everybody will see what you're talking about during that meeting. But hey, I think what we've just talked about applies in and out of the pandemic, the communication idea. And something that really stuck out to me as you were sharing is if we want to communicate effectively with our congregation and our people, it starts with communicating effectively with our staff and our leaders. And just being able to let them know ahead of time, making sure that they're on the same page. And that can just really exponentially help with your congregation. So, Hey, Charlie, why don't you wrap us up? What's kind of your final thought or a final word for us today?
Really, it's our privilege and responsibility as leaders and pastors to continually and passionately communicate our church's vision so that people's hearts are moved and they go, yes, I'm in. I'm part of this. And we can do that through all of our church communications. We can tie it back to vision, get them excited. It takes more work than just dumping information out there, but it's worth the work because people then feel like they are part of something bigger, because they are. It all gets tied back to why we're here as the church and moving forward God's kingdom.
That sounds really, really good. And when you can come together, when the pastor and leaders come together and they're stirred up and excited and they say, I'm in, that's when we really see effective communication happen. So thanks for sharing what you shared today, Charlie. I think it's so important. And we want to let you know, as you listen to this or watch this, that you can go to our website, transformingcc.com. And there you could download a podcast sheet. And it has some questions, it has a process, it has a summary of what we talked about. It may be great to go through with your team or some leaders. And if you would like us to help you in any way to walk through this, we do. That's what we're here. We're here to serve you as a church. And you can connect with us through transformingcc.com. And there are just some links there to get you to us. Well, thanks again, Charlie, for your expertise and what you're sharing. And for the rest of you, if this has added value to you, we want to encourage you. Would you share this as well with some people who need it? Hey, have a blessed day.